Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete and detailed Escoffier guide. Escoffier, or Escoffier, is the newest 5-star cryo polearm character who was just released in version 5.6, and she's an incredible freeze support, healer, damage dealer, and buffer. In this video, we're going to talk about everything you need to know about Escoffier, covering her best builds, artifacts, weapons, teams, constellations, and much more. Before we begin, however, I do want you guys to know that I do stream most sets on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and without further ado, let's talk about Escoffier. Alright, now starting things off, what does Escoffier actually do? Well, firstly, let's talk about Escoffier's elemental skill. This is an ability that, once pressed, will summon an all-spectrum multi-use cooking mech that will follow your active character and deal cryo damage to nearby opponents. This is an ability that will stay on field even when your Escoffier swaps out, and it will constantly be dealing some cryo damage that is mostly single target, although if the enemies you're fighting are close enough together, then it will actually have a little bit of AoE on every hit, which can be useful, although for the most part, it is mostly single target hits. This ability will also have a hit of Usia aligned damage, which can help against certain Fontanian enemies, and crucially, this ability will help you apply cryo and deal a surprising amount of damage from off-field passively alongside your active character. As we will see later in the video, Escoffier's damage is nothing to scoff at, as especially when buffed, it really does add up. Another reason for this that I actually want to talk about right now before we even get into her burst is because of her second passive talent, Inspiration Immersed Seasoning. What this will do is decrease the hydro and cryo res of opponents that her elemental skill or burst hits by up to 55% depending on how many hydro and cryo characters you have in your party. In fact, if your full party is all hydro and or cryo characters, you will get a 55% res shred to both hydro and cryo to any opponent that you hit. This res shred will last for 12 seconds and is refreshed anytime they get hit, so it effectively will have 100% uptime with a really good effect. It's worth highlighting that because she shreds cryo res on top of hydro, she's also buffing her own damage, which is why, as I said earlier, her skill's damage can be surprisingly high because she's also buffing herself, making her own damage good on top of also making your other party members do more damage. This passive talent will effectively form your team building. It incentivizes you to run teams that are all hydro and cryo units, replacing your other res shredder like a Kazuha or Shilonin with Escoffier herself alongside other hydro and cryo units. Now you'll notice that the difference between a 3 hydro or cryo party and a 4-1 is very big. You go from 15% res shred to 55, meaning that while Escoffier is still viable in other teams because of how much she has in her kit, as we'll talk about in the next section, she is very much incentivized to be played in these freeze teams that are comprised of only hydro and cryo units, but again, there are some exceptions that we'll cover later. Now with that out of the way, for Escoffier's elemental burst, this is an ability that will deal AoE cryo damage with a decent scaling, while also healing all of your party members based on her attack. This is an ability with a 15-second cooldown and a 60 energy cost, and the healing that this ability gives you is honestly very nice. In fact, this ability healing all of your party members one single time when you use your burst is very nice, as it can help you synergize well with a character like Farina by healing all of your party members simultaneously. With that said, through Escoffier's first passive talent, she will also get more healing to your active character only, healing them every second for 9 seconds after she uses her burst. So in practice, her burst will be 1 hit of damage and then 1 instance of burst healing to your whole party, and then it will continuously heal your active character for 9 seconds. Both Escoffier's damage and healing scale with attack, which is appreciated, as we'll see in the build section later. Something else I wanted to point out is that while it's not relevant in combat, Escoffier can hold her skill to allow her to transform ingredients into dishes, allowing you to basically get free dishes every week if that's something you're interested in, as a nice bonus if you have the character. Lastly, before getting into a small healing showcase, for Escoffier's talent priority, you should know that both her skill and burst are important to level, with her skill being the priority to maximize her damage and the burst being nice to increase her healing. Because of this, I would recommend leveling her skill and then her burst and ignoring her normal attacks. With that said, before we get into my review of this character and initial thoughts, for a quick healing showcase, I'm going to showcase that right now with 2 builds, one with a cryo bonus goblet and one with attack. Obviously the one with attack healing more, and you'll be able to see that her team-wide healing and then healing to the active character is surprisingly good, even with just a damage focused build. So while we'll cover her builds later in the video, it is important to understand that her healing at a baseline is quite good, having a burst heal to your whole party and then healing your active character afterwards. It is also worth noting that my talent level is only 8 on my burst, meaning that if I were to level it and even go for a more healing focused build, my Escoffier could heal quite a bit more than what you're seeing, although she already heals more than enough while also doing great damage. And so when you add everything up, Escoffier is a character who really has so much in her kit. As we saw, she's someone who can provide you with a lot of healing to all of your party and especially your active character, while also having really good and surprising off-field damage that is also buffed by her own res shred, which is another one of her huge strengths, which is having big big Cryo and Hydro res shred, increasing the damage of all of your Hydro and Cryo characters. This res shred does come with a condition of wanting your party to be only Hydro and Cryo characters in order to get its maximum value of 55%. In practice, this means two things. Firstly, because Escoffier does so much damage, healing, and res shred for your freeze teams, it is a massive buff to existing freeze teams and potentially future ones as well. Because her healing and kit synergizes so well with someone like Farina, who will also buff her damage, while also dealing great damage herself and buffing your other party members. Any team with Farina, Escoffier, and then another strong off-field character like Yelan, and then virtually any character that is Hydro or Cryo can clear the Abyss and perform very well. For example, I even did a clear with Aloy as my on-field quote-unquote DPS, but obviously it's my off-field characters here that are carrying. Obviously, if you're running a strong character here, a strong freeze carry, then it's even better, making freeze as an archetype a lot stronger. Because Escoffier is basically like a 2 or 3-in-1, she, paired with other strong sub-DPSs, can carry a team and perform very well. Do note that while Escoffier's passive is restrictive in terms of team building for freeze, and would remove your Anemo slot like Kazuha for example, for Escoffier, while you would lose out on 40% res shred and some elemental damage bonus, you would gain Escoffier's 55% res shred, have a team-wide healer, good cryo application, and also amazing personal damage, which not only makes up for it, but also allows you to not need to run a healer in your team, replacing the healer in your team with an offensive option, like going from Kokomi to Farina and Freeze, which definitely helps your team do a lot more damage overall. She has genuinely been a really big buff to Ayaka's Freeze teams as the premier example, but obviously the same can be said about a ton of Cryo and Hydro units having much stronger and more competitive Freeze teams now, like Ganyu, Risley, Ayato, Neuvillette, or a ton of other options that we'll go over in the team section. Outside of just that though, the second thing I wanted to mention is that because her kit is so kind of overloaded, because there's so much in her kit, even in non-freeze teams, in teams that don't just have Hydro and Cryo characters, she can still be a strong character. In fact, she also has pretty good Cryo application, which is something I also wanted to mention, having virtually the same as someone like Rosaria, while also having good personal damage, healing, and still some res shred, typically 10 or 15%, even if you're not getting the full 55% from her passive. Because of this, Escoffier ends up being more versatile than you'd think, being a huge upgrade to freeze teams, but still viable outside of them. Still a strong healer and damage dealer, a 2-in-1 when you're looking for a healer, maybe one that synergizes with Farina, with both of these characters again buffing each other, being able to be played with a melt carry or almost any DPS, while obviously specializing with Cryo and Hydro characters in a freeze team. And so because of this, I think Escoffier is a character who is incredible overall. She is a much needed buff to freeze teams, and if you plan on playing her in freeze teams, running Cryo and Hydro units, or even mono Cryo or mono Hydro, teams that can make use of her passive, I think she's insane, and in general, just a buff to freeze and a really good support there. Her res shred, damage, healing, and cryo application are all very nice, with her only real weakness outside of team building restrictions being that most of her damage is single target. And so because of this, if you play those teams and like freeze in general, then I can highly recommend Escoffier for existing Cryo and Hydro units and even future ones like probably Skirk, but it is still too early to tell. So overall, incredible for freeze and highly recommended if you are a fan of Cryo and Hydro focused team comps, whereas she can still be a solid character and healer outside of her niche in other teams. And with that out of the way, let's talk about how to actually build your Escoffier. So firstly, for most people, I'd say that the Golden Troop set will be your best in slot overall as the most consistent and universal option. This set will give you up to 70% elemental skill damage bonus from the 4-piece, which is great for Escoffier as the majority of her damage will come from her skill. This set effect will basically always be active, and so the 70% skill damage bonus you're gaining is just a lot of damage, and it makes Golden Troop the most recommended and generalistic strongest option for Escoffier. Now, if you don't have a Golden Troop set, or maybe just don't have a good one, an alternative set you can use is going to be the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer. Now, this set does come with a few problems that I want to talk about, but it does give you a lot of stats that can make it strong. Firstly, the 2-piece set will give you 15% crowd damage bonus, and then the 4-piece will give you up to 40% crit rate. In fact, you'll get 20% crit rate against opponents affected by cryo, and another 20% for a total of 40 against opponents that are frozen. Now, it is important for me to mention that in a freeze team against enemies that can be frozen, Blizzard Strayer will give you the most damage. With that said, I still would not recommend it over Golden Troop for a few reasons. Firstly, freeze teams in general are great against enemies that can be frozen already, and can struggle a bit more against enemies that can't be frozen, such as bosses. Now, while Escoffier makes freeze teams a lot better basically everywhere and viable in most content, and much more consistent, I'd say, it is still worth going for a generalistic set, especially because of how prevalent bosses are in endgame content like the Spiral Abyss and even Imaginarium Theater, where a lot of the times in a lot of, say, Abyss rotations, there will be bosses that can't be frozen, where having a set that helps you out in this more difficult content against these more difficult enemies will be of great value to your Escoffier and your team as a whole. On top of that, while getting a lot of crit rate is definitely nice, it is important to understand that Escoffier does ascend with crit rate, on top of also getting more crit rate through the CRYO resonance that you'll probably have active, meaning that if you are running the Blizzard Destroyer set, you cannot run a crit rate weapon with your Escoffier without overcapping at least a bit. This obviously will make building her more restrictive. With that said, even if enemies can't be frozen, provided you're maintaining the CRYO aura on them, the 20% crit rate on top of the 15% crowd damage bonus will still make it a viable and pretty strong set, coming in second place after Golden Troop. And so my general thoughts on this set are that it definitely comes with restrictions, but in a freeze team, it is going to be a viable set, the best in slot against enemies that can be frozen, and in second place against enemies that can't. With that said, if you are looking for a set to farm, I would recommend Golden Troop as not only a more consistent and universally strong option, but it's also a more efficient domain to farm and a better set for your overall account. And so that's how I feel about the damage dealing sets. Golden Troop's your best overall, and Blizzard Destroyer is in second place as a solid but conditional alternative. Outside of that, if you don't have any good set, you can mix and match two pieces with useful effects until you get something better, and it's definitely viable. Lastly, regarding supportive sets like Tenacity the Millith or Noblesse Oblige, while they definitely work, if you really want your Escoffier to be a pure support, maybe in a team where you don't care about her damage and want to buff attack scalers, typically I would recommend running these supportive sets on other support units that don't deal as much damage, because Escoffier is a character who does a surprising and really high amount of damage from off-field in most teams. For those reasons, I typically recommend focusing on building her for damage and giving her an artifact set that will maximize it. She still will have a good uptime on something like Millilith if you really want to use it, but typically recommend going for a set that gives you damage like the ones I mentioned previously. Now for the stats you're looking for on Escoffier, here's what you need to know. Firstly, both her damage and healing will scale on attack percent. Because of this, having attack on your pieces is nice, and also having both crit rate and crit damage will help maximize your damage as much as possible. As we saw earlier, Escoffier is a character who heals a lot, even if she's not on a purely healing focused build, and because she deals so much damage, well, maximizing her damage should be your priority, as while you're doing that, she'll also heal your team a lot. Because of this, looking for crit rate, crit damage, and attack percent on all of your pieces is recommended. Outside of that, energy recharge is also important, and you want to build as much energy recharge as you need to burst every rotation. Now, it is important to point out that for Escoffier in particular, her energy recharge amounts can vary very heavily based on what team you're running and how many CRYO characters are in your team. In a lot of her quote-unquote standard freeze teams, you will be running her alongside two other CRYO units, which can make her need a very small amount of energy recharge and make it very negligible. You may also run Escoffier in teams with only one other CRYO unit and maybe two Hydros, where she'll need a moderate amount of ER, or on the flip side, because Escoffier's damage and healing is so high, you can run her in teams where she isn't really designed to be played, meaning as the only CRYO option in a generic team. Well, in those teams, she will need a lot more energy recharge. So to give you guys a rough idea, rough ranges of what you can expect, in an optimal scenario with 3 CRYO characters total, she will need a very small amount, like around 110 to 140% ER, depending on your team. For double CRYO, it'll range from anywhere from 130 to 170 ER, once again varying heavily as teams with like Ayaka or Neuvillette can need less than the other generic double CRYO teams. And as a solo CRYO, Escoffier can need a lot of energy recharge, like upwards of 200% if you're bursting every rotation. Keep in mind that the exact amount you need will vary also based on how many Favonius users are in your team and your exact team composition, so test out what works for you, and these are mostly just helpful, generalistic energy recharge ranges that I put on screen. Now with that said, for the main stats you're looking for, it will be very straightforward. Typically you're looking for attack percent on your sands to maximize your damage, although an energy recharge sands is viable in teams where you really need a lot, although typically it's more recommended to get your energy from your substats and maybe even your weapon, but ER sands can be viable with attack percent being your general go-to best option for damage, crit rate or crit damage on your circlet, and crowd damage bonus or attack percent on your goblet. Now keep in mind that while crowd damage bonus is the general option for damage, Escoffier is actually a character who gains a lot of damage bonus through external buffs like the Golden Troop set and maybe even Farina, who synergizes very well with her. Because of this and the big amount of damage bonus you may be getting, an attack percent goblet can actually be better in some teams for your damage. Outside of that, attack percent can also help you get more healing, which definitely makes it a great option overall. With that said, if you are running Shenhe, because of the way her icy quills work, crowd damage bonus will definitely be better for your Escoffier's damage, and so which goblet is better for you will depend on the team you're running. Because of this, I would recommend choosing whichever goblet you have that has better substats, or which is better for your desired team and playstyle. Definitely go crowd damage if you're running Shenhe. It's still a great damage option. It can be your best for a generic team, whereas if you are getting a lot of damage percent, then attack percent will be very similar and sometimes slightly better, while also giving you more healing. So overall, both crowd damage and attack percent can be great options for Escoffier. Next up, for Escoffier's best weapons, here's what you need to know. Firstly, Escoffier's signature weapon is naturally going to be the best for her, and it's the first 5-star supportive catalyst option that we've ever gotten. In fact, the weapon is great for Escoffier because not only does it give her good stats, having the same stat line as Staff of Homa, with a lot of crit damage and a decent base attack, but also giving her a total of 56% attack through its passive from off-field, provided you're healing. On top of that, it also will give a 32% attack buff to the characters that you heal, which is great when she's paired with attack scaling characters. And because of the way that Escoffier's healing works, this buff will constantly be refreshed to your active character, making it great at increasing your DPS's attack, even providing an attack buff to someone like Shenhe, which is relevant for her own buff. So overall, just a great polearm for buffing and for damage that is nice for a healer like Escoffier. With that said, if you don't have her signature weapon, that is perfectly fine, as there are a ton of other good polearms that you can use. Firstly, any good stat stick that gives you a lot of attack and or damage is appreciated. Calamity Queller gives you a ton of attack and is a great 5-star for Escoffier. Staff of Homa also gives you a ton of stats, and so do some of the crit rate 5-stars like Lumiduce, Jade Spear, Crimson Moon Semblance, or Staff of Scarlet Sands. Keep in mind that with these weapons, you want to be careful not to overcap on crit rate, but they are all pretty solid. It is also worth pointing out that Deathmatch is generally your best generic 4-star option if you do buy the Battle Pass, as it is just another stat stick giving you crit and attack through the effect. Deathmatch is generally the 4-star I recommend the most, being even better than some of the 5-star options and just a really good option and generally your best offensive 4-star. Outside of that, energy recharge weapons can be viable as well in teams where you need that energy recharge, meaning that Engulfing Lightning and Skyward Spine can both be solid stat sticks. In a similar vein, Favonius Lance is viable as a supportive weapon in teams that need a lot of energy recharge, although it's obviously not the best for her personal damage, but it's appreciated in teams that maybe don't have that many cryo characters. And I also wanted to mention somewhere that Vortex Vanquisher is viable for just giving you some attack percent. Outside of that, for some 4-star weapons you could use, Prospector's Drill can be good for a high base attack as well as some more attack and damage through the effect, especially with Refinement, although it doesn't have the best uptime. Mountain Bracing Bolt is also solid if you can use the energy recharge, as it will also give you a lot of elemental skill damage bonus through its effect. Outside of that, for some solid free-to-play options you can use, there are 2 that came through events, namely the recent Lantern polearm we got that gives you a lot of energy recharge and 40% attack through its effect after using your skill, on top of having a high base attack, which makes it a solid free-to-play choice for your Escoffier. The other event weapon that is a bit older is the Missive Windspear, which is just an attack percent stat stick that gives you a lot of attack even though the elemental mastery is wasted. Lastly, Blackcliff Pole can be a viable option that you can get from the shop if you don't have one of the better weapons that I mentioned. Overall, Escoffier can use basically any good stat stick that gives her any of the stats that she's looking for. Her signature weapon is great for the buffs that it gives your team and her, with any 5-star stat stick or even 4-star like Deathmatch being great options as well. With that general information out of the way, I will put a rough weapon ranking on screen now of Escoffier in different teams with different energy recharge requirements. Keep in mind that a lot of assumptions go into weapon rankings, so the exact ranking for you and which weapon will be better for you will depend based on your team's artifacts, rotations, and much more, so use this only to get a rough idea. I also want to end this section by re-emphasizing that Deathmatch is a solid 4-star choice, a really good option if you do buy the Battle Pass because of the stats that it gives you. I also wanted to point out that supportive weapons like especially her signature, which gives an attack buff to your team and especially your active character, and also to a certain extent Favonius, if your other teammates make use of the energy particles that it gives you, can perform better in practice than what you're seeing on this sheet because of the buffs that they give you on top of your Escoffier's personal damage. So for both her signature weapon and Favonius Lance, keep in mind that they can be better for your team's overall damage than what you're just seeing through this weapon ranking. Alright, now next up for Escoffier's Constellations, here's what you need to know. Firstly, for her first constellation, this is one that will only work if all 4 of your party members are Hydro or Cryo. If that's the case, Escoffier will give your party members a 60% crit damage increase to their Cryo damage for 15 seconds after she uses her skill or burst. Effectively, this will just be a solid buff to your Cryo damage, buffing only the Cryo characters in your team. The uptime on this will be over 100%, so you don't have to worry about that, but it does restrict your team building similarly to her passive, really making sure that you don't have any other elements other than Hydro or Cryo. Overall, in a Cryo-based team, this will be a pretty solid team DPS increase of around 15 to 20 or 25%, making it a pretty nice supportive constellation. Once again, this constellation is just for your Cryo damage, so it won't help your Hydro off-fielders like Farina or Yelan, but it's really nice when you pair her alongside a Cryo carry, as it will buff their damage and also your Escoffier's personal damage as well. Overall, this is a pretty solid C1, and next up, for Escoffier's C2, this will give her 5 cold dish stacks after using her skill, which acts similarly to Shenhe's Icy Quills. When an active character that isn't Escoffier deals Cryo damage, their damage will be buffed 5 times, with each time consuming doing a cold dish stack. This damage increase is definitely appreciated, provided you can make sure to trigger it on your cryo damage dealer, your main DPS, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not the most insane C2, it's not the biggest increase, it's okay, but it isn't as good as your first Constellation, and it's kind of just okay. Outside of that, Escoffier's C3 and C5 increase her talent levels, with C3 increasing her skills talent level, which is honestly pretty decent for her personal damage, and C5 increasing her burst level. For Escoffier's fourth Constellation, this one will make her single target healing last longer for 6 more seconds, while also giving it 7 chances to crit, scaling with your crit rate. When it crits, it will heal you for more and also restore 2 energy to your Escoffier, and if you trigger this 7 times, it will give you a total of 14 energy. This is nice, allowing you to need less energy, and it will allow you to heal your active character more. This is definitely appreciated. More healing is always good, and it can help even stack up your Farina faster, but because it's only your single target healing that's being buffed, it doesn't seem to be the biggest deal outside of just getting more energy and being comfy for more healing. But overall, it's not the most insane Constellation though. Lastly, your 6th Constellation will give her 6 big hits of skill damage per skill cast that will deal 500% of her attack as AoE cryo damage as your active party member does normal charge or plunge attacks. This is a pretty nice bonus of front-loaded AoE cryo damage that is appreciated. It's obviously some nice burst of damage from off-field, but obviously it is a C6, so keep that in mind. And so overall for Constellations, I say that her first one is a good early stopping point, and the other ones are kind of alright, but not the craziest, especially when compared to some of the recent characters with more insane Constellations. Now lastly, if you're debating between getting her first Constellation and her signature weapon, I'd say that they're both pretty strong options with the quote-unquote correct upgrade depending on what you're looking for. In fact, her first Constellation will typically be a bit of a bigger damage increase to your team if you're playing a cryo carry, whereas her signature weapon is a bit more of a flexible option, meaning that it could also be used on other characters like Chevris or Yansan. Because of this, which is better for you will depend on your team and what you're looking for. As I said, her C1 can be a bit of a bigger increase to a cryo freeze team's damage, whereas her signature weapon will still be a sizable team DPS increase and great for your Escoffier as well, but is also a weapon that you can use on some other supports as well. For those reasons, I say to evaluate which you value more and what are on the banners that you may be pulling for. Personally, I value the weapon a bit more because I like having a strong supportive weapon on my account, but her first Constellation is also great for cryo characters. With that said, keep in mind that Escoffier is a great character even at C0, so while both her first Constellation and her signature are great, don't feel forced to pull for something you don't want. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's get into one of the most important sections, which is regarding Escoffier's best teams and synergies. So firstly, it is no secret that Escoffier is a character designed around the freeze reaction. For those reasons, she will naturally pair well with cryo and hydro characters that are played in a freeze team, where she can maximize her passive talent and provide your team with so much that she's undoubtedly a part of the best freeze teams, making them a lot stronger than they were before. Before we get into the specifics of that though, I also want to highlight the point that I made earlier in the video that Escoffier can also be more flexible than you'd think. This is because Escoffier is a character who does a lot of good off-field damage, gives you team-wide healing, and also a lot of res shred. Now obviously the most if you're in an only hydro and cryo team comp, but even if you just have 1 or 2 other hydro or cryo units, you still have some, which gives her access to some non-freeze teams where she fits even though she kind of isn't supposed to because of all of these strong sides of her, on top of also having relatively fast cryo application. Alright, now to get into more specifics, firstly, Escoffier synergizes very well with Farina. This is because both Escoffier and Farina will give your team a lot of buffs while also having good off-field damage. Farina is also hydro, which means you can place her in freeze teams with Escoffier, and her buff does depend on draining your team's health passively, which Escoffier will heal back up, being a healer who can synergize well with Farina, on top of also buffing each other's damage and also buffing your main DPS's damage as well, making them just a really strong duo. On top of just that, you can also run another strong hydro character here like Yelan to have a new team core, which is being called Wheelchair, where you can effectively play almost any DPS in the last slot and have so much off-field damage from your Farina, Yelan, and Escoffier that will basically carry your team. Outside of that, I also wanted to mention that Shenhe is a character who obviously will synergize really well with a cryo DPS you may be running, but whose buffs and icy quills will also be given to your Escoffier, buffing her damage as well as the other cryo characters you're running, giving some synergy there. Alright, now with that said, let's get into some specific teams now and where you actually can play your Escoffier. Alright, so firstly, you can run Escoffier with basically any cryo carry in a freeze team. The premier freeze carry who got a lot better with her release is Ayaka. Ayaka's always been the go-to freeze DPS, and she's a character who's getting honestly a lot better. Her team damage is a lot higher now that Escoffier is released, who's a part of her best premium team. Ayaka, Escoffier, Farina, and then a flexible last slot will work incredibly well, with Shenhe being the best here, but other options like Yelan or another generic cryo or hydro can work work as well. In a team like this, as mentioned, Shenhe and Furina will buff both your Ayaka and Escoffier, meaning that you'll have a lot of team damage coming from a few different sources, with Ayaka obviously being your main DPS. Outside of that, Wriothesley freeze teams did get better as well, where once again you'll run Escoffier, Furina, and then either Shenhe or Yelan as your best last slot option. Shenhe will be the best for your Wriothesley's personal damage, whereas Yelan will be great for your team's overall DPS and can help if your Wriothesley maybe isn't as invested and will make a strong team overall, although your Wriothesley will be a bit more of an on-field driver here. Similarly, Ganyu freeze teams will also run Escoffier, and they work very nicely as well. These Ganyu teams lose out on the grouping from an Anemo support, which have good synergy with Ganyu's burst, but Escoffier's damage and res shred and also healing definitely make up for it and shine in making the team better in single target and just being really good for freeze carries like even Ganyu. Do note that for cryo carries like Ganyu and Wriothesley, they also have melt teams that can be very strong as well, but now their freeze team options did get a lot better with Escoffier. That is definitely a part of them. Keep in mind that the slots you're running here outside of Escoffier are pretty flexible, but you obviously really want to use Furina if you have her for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Outside of that, you can just run basically any cryo or hydro on fielder in a freeze team and it will work. 4-star cryo and hydro units like Kaya, Rosaria, and Xingqiu can all be used here if you don't have a quote-unquote premium option, and they all can make a surprisingly strong freeze team. Outside of that, you can also run hydro DPSs or hydro on fielders like Kokomi, Ayato, or even Child that can work in a freeze team with Escoffier. Escoffier can be an upgrade to what would otherwise be a quote-unquote mono hydro team with an Anemo buffer or someone like Shilonin, but now you run Escoffier and you freeze instead. Outside of that, you can technically run mono crowd teams as well, although typically I'd rather just put a strong hydro character like Furina there instead. I also do have to mention Freeze Neuvillette, which is another one of his viable teams now, despite Escoffier and her team building restrictions having negative synergy with Neuvillette's passive. In fact, Neuvillette can be played alongside Furina, Escoffier, and either a generic res shredder or ideally Sitlali as your last slot, and this can be a new, pretty weird Neuvillette freeze team that surprisingly will work and be competitive with his strongest teams. Now, obviously there are a lot of upsides and downsides here that I don't really have time to get into, but generally it's just a team that gives you a shorter rotation because Escoffier's res shred has a 100% uptime compared to someone like Kazuha's that needs to be refreshed mid-rotation, and high team damage by also allowing your Escoffier to deal damage on top of just your Neuvillette, with Sitlali who will give you a shield which is very nice for a C0 Neuvillette, on top of also having the scroll set to buff Hydro and Cryo, Hydro res shred, and then also everything that Escoffier gives you. Now keep in mind that this team will also work at C1, but it will have a bit less synergy because the shield is less appreciated, and also you end up going from 3 passive stacks to 2 instead of 2 to 1, which is a bigger loss given how Neuvillette's passive works, but for the most part, it is genuinely just another one of Neuvillette's strong team options. With that said, I don't recommend pulling Escoffier just for Neuvillette, going out of your way to do that, so let me make that clear, but if you do want her or have her available, this is another one of Neuvillette's many really strong team options that works surprisingly well. This team doesn't scale as well with Escoffier's vertical investment, and can be a bit better in single target because of how Escoffier's skill works, and also being great when the enemies you're fighting can give you an extra stack for your Neuvillette. Overall though, it is a really good team, competitive with his best options depending on the situation, a really good team you can use for C0 Neuvillette, giving him another really good team as if he didn't have enough already. With that said, personally, after having played this team a lot since Escoffier came out as a C0 Neuvillette, I do really like it. It's probably the comfiest Neuvillette team for me, and it's been performing the best out of my personal teams in my personal feels crafted experience. But it's generally just another one of his many amazing options, as I mentioned. If you do want a more detailed analysis of the Neuvillette Escoffier pairing though, do check out my good friend Jamie's video, which I linked in the description down below. Outside of that, I do want to highlight here that Escoffier should be a part of any freeze team with basically any cryo or hydro unit that may come out in the future, and even from just what we know now, it is highly likely that just from the artifact set alone, Skirk will likely be a cryo carry who can be ran with Escoffier, and if that's true, Escoffier will probably be a part of her best teams, which is important to highlight if you are planning to play freeze or are interested in Skirk, but obviously this is subject to change. And so obviously she's good in freeze. Now outside of just her niche, you can run the quote-unquote wheelchair core that I mentioned earlier with basically any carry, and you can even use her in some melt teams as your off-field cryo. With that said, depending on your team and rotation, you may want to run another cryo character there too, and note that Escoffier won't give as much to a melt team as someone like Sitlali, so she's definitely not a replacement in that regard, but she can still work as an off-field cryo applier, damage dealer, and healer. She can also be ran alongside Sitlali for good cryo, healing, and good personal damage as well, also being buffed by Sitlali's scroll set, and she can be played alongside almost any pyro carry like Maoika, Arlecchino, Yoimiya, Hu Tao, Gaming, or others. You can use her in a Chaska freeze team as a viable and surprisingly strong option there too, depending on what characters you have available. You can also use her with Ito, Navia, or even Kanich if you have enough pyro in your team. Or once again, as just just a generic sub DPS whenever you need one and want some healing as well. And so as you can see, Escoffier does have a ton of viable teams, with her being a huge buff to freeze. With that said, obviously this section didn't include every single team you can play, but I think it gives you guys a general idea. With that said, I'm now going to get into a team DPS showcase of my Escoffier in 3 different teams, namely Ayaka, Neuvillette, and one half with just Farina, Yelan, and Rosaria, being a more quick swappy playstyle. I'm trying to focus this around freeze teams because this is her quote-unquote niche, but she obviously works in other teams as a solid support and healer as well. With that said, for this showcase, I'm going to run her signature weapon, Constellation 0, 4-piece golden troop, and level 9 8 talents, so still room for improvement. With that said, my ratio is pretty good with 83 crit rate, plus more through CRYO resonance, over 220 crit damage, and then 135 ER, but the exact amount may vary from team to team. Oh, and do keep in mind that for the second half of the Spiral Abyss, there's currently a CRYO skill damage buff, which will give my Escoffier a bit more damage, so keep that in mind. But overall, I hope you enjoyed the guide, and I really hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go.
A little loose boosh. Juice on the loose. Here comes the catch. A burst of flavor. Quietly now. My name, echoing song. Showing you things. Things are about to get dicey. Lights out. Pinnacle of excellence! Obey! Do your master's bidding! A burst of flavor! Take flight! Coming Satular! Summon! Unleash! My name's Echoing! Adaptive by ordinance divine. There's on the loose. Whirling snow. Let my name echo in song. A little CRYO incarnate. A burst of flavor. For more. By ordinance divine. Pinnacle of excellence. Let's begin. Let my name echo in song. Transfiguration. Do your master's bidding. Adaptive frosting.
And so yeah, overall I think Escoffier is a great character, a big buff to freeze, and one that will help basically all the existing CRYO and Hydro characters, and probably future ones as well, but I guess only time will tell. With that said, she's a character who I've been really enjoying, and I hope you guys enjoyed the guide and showcase. As always, if there's anything I want to add, it will be in a pinned comment, so be sure to check that. Thanks so much for watching, I hope this guide was helpful, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.